Before you think about heading out on a solo camping trip, hear me out. What was supposed to be a peaceful escape turned into my worst nightmare. Strange handprints on my RV, shadowy figures in the darkness, and something, or someone, watching me. It all happened at Dead Man's Gulch, and I barely made it out alive. Stay tuned to find out why I'll never camp alone again. If you love chilling stories like this, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe for more terrifying tales every week. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had a camping experience that left you questioning reality. I pulled the RV off the narrow, dusty road and into the shadow of Dead Man's Gulch. The engine sputtered to a stop, and for a moment, I sat in the silence, staring out at the barren valley stretching before me. The Ruby Mountains loomed in the distance, their jagged peaks cutting into the orange and purple hues of the setting sun. It was hauntingly beautiful, and exactly what I needed. Isolation, quiet, a place where the world couldn't find me. This was the kind of freedom I craved after Laura passed. The RV had become my escape. I could roam wherever I wanted, park wherever I pleased, and for a while, it helped. It felt like running away from all the pitying looks, the whispered condolences, the empty assurances that things would get better. They didn't understand how grief hollowed you out, left you a shell of yourself. Solitude was the only thing that didn't demand answers I didn't have. But as I sat there in the fading light, the stillness felt wrong. The air was heavy, thick, like it was pressing down on me. For the first time in a long time, I felt the faint stirrings of unease. It was ridiculous. I was in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town, with nothing but desert and sky around me. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Shaking off the nerves, I stepped out of the RV and stretched. The desert air bit at my skin, a sharp reminder of how quickly the temperature dropped after sunset. I scanned the horizon. Nothing but dry earth and sagebrush. Perfect. I wanted to be somewhere people wouldn't bother me, and Dead Man's Gulch certainly fit the bill. The name had caught my attention when I spotted it in an old ghost storybook at a thrift store. Some legend about miners who vanished in the late 1800s after seeing shadowy figures near the old mining shafts. Supposedly the earth had swallowed them whole. The locals called it cursed, but I wasn't here for ghost stories. I was here for silence. The campsite was simple, a flat patch of dirt near the remnants of an old mining camp. Rusted carts sat abandoned in the dust, and what was left of a cabin leaned precariously against a hillside. I spotted a collapsed mineshaft half buried under debris, its dark entrance barely visible through the rocks. It was eerie, sure, but it was perfect. No people. No distractions. Just me, the desert, and the stars. The sun dipped below the horizon as I finished setting up. The RV's lights cast a faint glow across the barren landscape, their steady hum oddly comforting. For the first time all day, I felt like I could breathe. I made myself a quick dinner, canned chili, nothing fancy, and settled in for the night. But even as I sat there staring out into the vast emptiness, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Dinner was quick, but every bite felt heavier than usual. I wasn't hungry, it was just something to do while the night pressed in. The air inside the RV felt thick, stifling, and the faint hum of the old generator wasn't enough to drown out the gnawing silence outside. I tried to distract myself by flipping through the thrift store ghost stories book I'd picked up on a whim. Its cracked spine and yellowed pages gave it an air of authenticity, but I didn't buy into the stories. Flipping to the section on Dead Man's Gulch, I skimmed over the tales of missing miners. They'd claimed to see shadowy figures moving in the fog before disappearing into the mines, swallowed up by the earth itself. The locals called the creature the Phantom of the Mines, a name that felt both cheesy and unsettling at the same time. I chuckled to myself, shaking my head. It was nonsense. The kind of thing bored townsfolk made up to keep kids from poking around dangerous places. Laura would have laughed at it too. She wasn't scared of anything, not the woods, not the wild, not even my irrational fears about leaving the city for the open road. Ghost stories are for people who can't handle the real world, she used to say, her fearless grin lighting up every room. I closed the book, my chest tightening at the memory. I wasn't like her. I wasn't fearless. The RV lights flickered suddenly, pulling me out of my thoughts. I froze, staring up at the ceiling as they blinked once, twice, before steadying again. My heart raced as I let out a shaky breath. Old RV, old wiring, I muttered under my breath, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But the cold that seeped into my bones said otherwise. I stood up, peering out the window. Darkness stretched endlessly, broken only by the faint shapes of rusted mining carts and twisted sagebrush. The beam from my flashlight cut through the shadows as I stepped outside. Gravel crunched under my boots, the only sound in the stillness. The air was colder now, sharper, biting at my exposed skin. Something wasn't right. I scanned the area, sweeping the flashlight across the remnants of the mining camp. Nothing moved. Just rocks and dirt and the skeletal remains of a cabin that looked like it could collapse with the next gust of wind. But then I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound. Gravel shifting. I whipped the flashlight in the direction of the noise, my pulse pounding in my ears. Nothing. Just shadows. I laughed nervously, the sound too loud in the quiet. Get a grip, Jake, I whispered to myself. It's just the wind. But as I turned back toward the RV, something caught my eye. Handprints. Long streaks of dust dragged down the windows, as if fingers had clawed across the glass. My breath caught, and the flashlight shook in my trembling hand. I was alone. Or at least, I should have been. The handprints shouldn't have been there. I hadn't seen anyone for miles, and the dust was undisturbed when I parked. Yet there they were, long, narrow streaks running down the RV's side windows. My stomach churned, and my breath felt caught in my throat. The flashlight beam quivered as I took a step closer, my boots crunching on the gravel. Up close, the streaks looked even more unnerving. They weren't random smudges, they were deliberate. 5 distinct fingers, each too long and thin to seem normal, dragged in perfect lines down the dusty glass. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe it was a trick of the light? Wind-blowing debris? But no amount of reasoning made sense of the eerie precision of those marks. Stop overthinking, I muttered, forcing a shaky laugh. You're alone, just the wind and your imagination. Still, the unease was like a weight on my chest, pressing harder with every second. I stepped back, scanning the darkness with the flashlight. The beam danced over rocks and shadows, the faint outline of the mine shaft visible in the distance. The silence was deafening now, wrapping around me like a living thing. I hurried back inside the RV, locking the door behind me with trembling hands. My pulse was racing, every thud echoing in my ears. I leaned against the door, staring at the windows, half expecting to see something, or someone, peering in. But there was nothing. Just the empty night and the quiet hum of the generator struggling against the cold. I needed a distraction. Something to shake off the creeping fear that was settling into my bones. I turned back to the small table, where the ghost storybook still sat open. Picking it up, I flipped to the part about Dead Man's Gulch again, skimming over the minor legends. Most of the stories followed a pattern. Shadowy figures seen near the mines, eerie whispers in the wind, and then sudden disasters. Rock slides, collapses, and people vanishing without a trace. One account stood out, A miner named Caleb swore he saw a dark thing with long arms and clawed fingers dragging something heavy across the valley floor. He tried to warn the others, but no one listened. Days later, the mine caved in, and Caleb disappeared with it. I closed the book, rubbing my temples. "Great bedtime reading, Jake," I muttered. The RV lights flickered again, this time more violently. My stomach sank as the hum of the generator cut out entirely, plunging the interior into an oppressive quiet. The sudden stillness was suffocating. I grabbed the flashlight and flicked it on, the beam slicing through the darkness. I felt the cold creeping in faster now, seeping through the RV walls like an unwelcome guest. Something was wrong. The air felt charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. And then, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of gravel shifting. This time, it was closer. Too close. The sound of shifting gravel froze me in place. It was faint, almost like someone testing their steps. Hesitant, but deliberate. My breath caught in my throat as I swung the flashlight toward the window. The beam quivered, catching only the emptiness outside. The shadows seemed deeper now, darker, as though the light couldn't quite push them away. I didn't want to go outside again. The safety of the RV's thin metal walls suddenly felt like a barrier I couldn't bear to cross. But the sound came again, this time louder, scraping against my nerves like nails on a chalkboard. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my shotgun, checked the shells, and unlocked the door. Stepping into the cold night, I was greeted by a silence so oppressive it felt alive. The desert had gone utterly still. No wind, no rustling sagebrush, not even the distant call of a coyote. Just the faint crunch of my boots as I scanned the area with the flashlight. The beam swept over the abandoned mining camp, catching the skeletal remains of the old cabin. Its shadow stretched unnaturally long, twisting in ways that didn't seem to match the shape of the structure. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking against the quiet. It sounded weak, like it didn't belong in this space. I swallowed hard, gripping the shotgun tighter. Nothing. No reply. Just the unrelenting silence. I told myself it was all in my head, an overactive imagination fueled by ghost stories and the isolation. But deep down, I knew better. Something was off about this place. As I turned to head back to the RV, the flashlight caught something in the dirt. Tracks, small, faint impressions trailing away from the RV toward the old mine shaft. They were human-like but wrong, each print elongated, with narrow toes that dug unnaturally deep into the dry earth. My stomach twisted as I crouched to get a better look. They didn't belong to a person, or at least, not to any person I'd ever seen. The flashlight flickered, and I cursed under my breath, smacking it until the beam steadied. When I glanced up again, the tracks seemed to go on forever, disappearing into the shadows near the mine. The air felt heavier now, pressing against my chest like a physical weight. "Just some animal," I whispered to myself, though I didn't believe it. No animal made tracks like these. Still, I forced myself to straighten up and head back to the RV, my nerves stretched thin. The moment I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me with a force that shook the walls. My heart jumped as I turned, shotgun at the ready, but no one was there. The cold was worse now, biting into my skin even inside the RV. I locked the door, checked the windows, and sat down, trying to catch my breath. And then faintly I heard it, a whisper. Too quiet to make out the words, but it was there. And it wasn't mine. The whisper sent a chill crawling up my spine. It wasn't the kind of sound you could mistake for the wind. It was deliberate, hushed, like someone was standing just outside the RV, murmuring under their breath. I froze, my shotgun resting across my lap, listening intently as the whisper rose and fell, almost melodic but utterly unnatural. "Who's there?" My voice cracked, barely above a whisper itself. I didn't expect an answer, and I didn't get one. The silence that followed was worse than the whisper. Thick, oppressive, like the air itself had turned against me. I forced myself to stand and check the windows again, moving cautiously. The beam of my flashlight reflected off the glass, revealing nothing but the dark expanse of the valley. Still, the whisper lingered, faint but present, like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. My grip on the shotgun tightened, and I paced to the center of the RV, unsure what to do. That's when I noticed the door. The heavy metal door that I'd locked, double-checked and deadbolted, was ajar. Just slightly, but enough to send my heart into overdrive. I stared at the deciders. Crack, the pale light from the RV's interior spilling out into the night. Slowly I stepped toward it, my pulse thundering in my ears. The whispering stopped as I reached the door, replaced by a silence so absolute it felt deafening. I slammed the door shut, locking it again with trembling hands. My breathing was ragged, my nerves frayed to the point of breaking. "It's nothing," I muttered to myself. "Just the wind." But even as the words left my mouth, I didn't believe them. I needed to calm down. Sitting at the small table, I grabbed the ghost story book again, desperate for a distraction. Flipping through the pages, I landed on another section about Dead Man's Gulch. One passage caught my eye, a miner's account of hearing whispers near the mine shaft before a cave-in. He described them as voices calling his name, though when he turned to look, no one was there. The whispers grew louder over time, driving him to the edge of madness. He claimed the mine was alive, filled with a darkness that wanted to consume anyone who got too close. I set the book down, my hands shaking. It was just a story, I reminded myself. A campfire tale to scare off curious locals. But the parallels were too close for comfort. The whispers, the uneasy stillness, the marks in the dirt. I glanced out the window again, shining the flashlight toward the mine. The entrance loomed like an open wound in the earth, jagged and dark, its shadow stretching unnaturally across the barren ground. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a flicker of something at the edge of the beam. I leaned closer to the glass, my breath fogging the window. And then, I saw them again. Handprints. Fresh, streaking across the outside of the glass, as if someone, or something, had just been there. The handprints were unmistakable. Fresh streaks of dust dragged in long, deliberate lines across the window pane. My stomach twisted as I stared at them, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The prints hadn't been there a moment ago, and they looked identical to the ones I'd seen earlier. But this time, they weren't just on one window, they were on all of them. I moved cautiously through the RV, checking each window one by one. The same streaks marked every surface, long fingers trailing down the glass as though something had circled the RV, dragging its hands along the windows. My pulse was pounding in my ears, my breathing shallow. I double-checked the locks, every latch secured, though it didn't feel like enough. The whispers started again. This time they were louder, more distinct. They came in bursts, almost like laughter, but garbled, distorted, as if several voices were speaking at once. The sound was all around me, above, below, outside. My heart raced as I tried to pinpoint where it was coming from, but it seemed to shift, slipping through the walls like smoke. I grabbed the shotgun, holding it tight against my chest, and steadied my breathing. "This isn't real," I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible over the growing noise. "It's just in your head." But then came the sound that shattered any illusion of safety. A low, deliberate knock, 3 heavy thuds against the RV's back door. I jumped, nearly dropping the flashlight. The knocking came again, louder this time, shaking the thin metal walls. It wasn't the wind. Someone, or something, was out there. I forced myself to move, creeping toward the back of the RV with the shotgun raised. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by a long scraping sound, as though nails were being dragged across the door. My grip tightened on the gun, sweat slicking my palms as I tried to control the shaking in my hands. "Who's there?" I called, my voice cracking. No response, just the scraping, slower now, more deliberate. My breath caught in my throat as I reached the door, my flashlight trembling in my grasp. The beam landed on the door's window, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shape. Something tall and thin, standing just beyond the glass. But when I blinked, it was gone. I backed away, my legs threatening to buckle beneath me. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, and the air inside the RV felt oppressive, heavy. It was as if the walls were closing in, trapping me in this waking nightmare. I stumbled back to the front of the RV, my mind racing, desperate to make sense of what was happening. That's when I noticed something new. A faint outline in the dust on the windshield, just visible under the beam of the flashlight. At first I thought it was more handprints. But as I moved closer, I realized it was different. It was a face, long and gaunt, with hollow eyes staring directly at me. The face in the dust froze me in place. It was impossibly long and gaunt, with hollowed-out eyes and an angular jaw that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its mouth was slightly open, as though caught mid-sentence, or mid-scream. My breath hitched, and the flashlight shook violently in my trembling hand. I wanted to look away, but its lifeless stare felt like it was drilling into me, pulling me toward it. The whispers surged again, louder than ever, surrounding me in a chaotic cacophony of fragmented voices. My ears throbbed as the voices overlapped, sometimes rising into what sounded like laughter, then falling into incomprehensible murmurs. It felt like they were speaking to me, or worse, about me. I stumbled back from the windshield, clutching the shotgun as though it could somehow protect me from whatever was out there. Then, just as suddenly as they began, the whispers stopped. The RV was plunged into silence once more, and for a fleeting moment, I almost convinced myself it was over. Maybe the face was a trick of the dust, my imagination playing games with me in the dim light. Maybe the whispers were just the wind swirling through the barren landscape. But then the RV shook. The entire vehicle lurched violently to the side, as though something massive had struck it. I hit the floor hard, the shotgun clattering out of my hands. Before I could scramble to my feet, the RV rocked again, this time harder, the groan of its metal frame filling the cabin. It felt like something, or someone, was outside, pushing against it with incredible force. Panic took over. I crawled to the shotgun, gripping it tightly as I pressed my back against the wall, heart pounding. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows across the small space. I aimed the gun at the door, my finger hovering over the trigger, waiting for whatever was out there to show itself. The RV groaned again, and then came the knocking. It wasn't on the back door this time. It was everywhere, on the walls, the roof, even the windows. A relentless, uneven pounding that echoed through the cabin like a drumbeat. My breathing quickened, my chest tightening with every thud. This wasn't random. It was deliberate, calculated. Whatever was outside wanted me to know it was there. I glanced at the windshield again, dreading what I might see. The face was gone, but in its place there was something worse, handprints. They weren't streaked or smudged like before. They were pressing against the glass, fresh and deliberate. One, then another, until the entire windshield was covered in them, overlapping, smothering the glass like a wall of fingers. I couldn't take it anymore. I threw open the RV's side window and fired the shotgun into the night. The sound was deafening, but it brought no relief. The pounding stopped, replaced by silence so thick it was suffocating. For a moment, I thought I'd scared whatever it was away. And then I heard it. A deep, guttural growl, low and menacing, coming from just behind me. The growl was unlike anything I'd ever heard, low, guttural, and rumbling, as though it came from deep within the earth itself. My blood ran cold, and my muscles locked up, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. It was behind me, close enough that I could feel the faint vibration of its presence in the air. I gripped the shotgun so tightly my knuckles turned white, my breath caught in my throat. Slowly I turned, dreading what I might see. My flashlight, still flickering weakly, cast jagged shadows across the RV's interior. But there was nothing there, just the cramped, cluttered space I'd grown accustomed to over the past few months. Yet the growl persisted, low and steady, as if it were circling me. I swung the flashlight wildly, the beam darting from corner to corner, but I saw nothing. Nothing. Then the RV shook again, harder this time. I fell to one knee, catching myself against the small kitchen counter. The growl faded, replaced by another sound, scratching. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing second. The sound of claws, or fingernails, dragging across the metal siding of the RV. My stomach twisted as the scratching moved, traveling from one side of the RV to the other, slow and deliberate, as though it was searching for a way in. I scrambled to my feet, shotgun raised, and pressed my back against the wall. My pulse pounded in my ears, my thoughts racing. Whatever this was, it wasn't an animal. It wasn't human either. I didn't know what it was, but it was toying with me, testing me, waiting for something. My hand shook as I tried to steady the shotgun, aiming it at the door, the windows, the roof, anywhere that seemed like a potential breach. The scratching stopped abruptly. For a moment, the silence was deafening, and I almost dared to hope it was gone. But then I heard it. A whisper. This time it was clear, distinct, and horrifyingly close. Jake. My name. It had spoken my name. The flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor, the beam casting erratic shadows across the RV. My heart was hammering in my chest, the sound drowning out every other thought. I pressed myself tighter against the wall, gripping the shotgun like it was my lifeline. The voice came again, softer this time, but somehow even more terrifying. Jake, let me in! It was right outside. I could feel it. The weight of its presence pressed against the thin walls of the RV, suffocating and unrelenting. My mind raced. Run? Fight? Stay? None of it felt like it would make a difference. The thing outside, the RV shook violently, and then, in an instant, the lights cut out completely. Darkness swallowed me whole. The only sound was my ragged breathing, and the faint creak of the RV door handle turning. The creak of the RV door handle sent a jolt of terror through me. It wasn't hurried or frantic, it was deliberate, like someone testing it, savoring the act. My flashlight lay on the floor where I dropped it, its beam flickering weakly across the cabinets. I gripped the shotgun tighter, my hands slick with sweat, and aimed at the door, willing myself not to pull the trigger prematurely. Go away, I shouted, my voice cracking under the weight of fear. The words sounded hollow, swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. The handle stopped moving. For a brief, fleeting moment, I allowed myself to hope that my outburst had scared whatever it was off. But then came the sound that shattered that illusion entirely. A low, drawn-out scraping noise, like nails being dragged across the metal siding of the RV. It started at the back and slowly made its way toward the front, the sound growing louder and more deliberate with each passing second. I couldn't move, couldn't think. My legs felt like lead, frozen in place as the scraping sound stopped just outside the driver's side window. My eyes darted toward the glass, but the faint beam of the flashlight didn't reach far enough to reveal what might be lurking there. And then I heard it again, Jake. The whisper was so close, it might as well have been in my ear. I flinched, swinging the shotgun toward the sound, but there was nothing there. The RV's small interior felt suffocating now, the air thick and heavy with something unseen. I tried to steady my breathing, but it was no use. Panic had taken hold of me completely. A sharp knock at the windshield snapped me back to reality. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. Once, twice, 3 times. My flashlight beam trembled as I aimed it at the glass, and what I saw made my blood turn to ice. A face. It was pressed against the windshield, impossibly close, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. The features were warped, too long and angular, as though it had been stretched unnaturally. Its mouth curled into a grotesque mockery of a grin, revealing jagged, uneven teeth. But what struck me the most was its eyes. Black, endless voids that seemed to pull me in, suffocating any thought of escape. The shotgun shook in my hands, but I couldn't pull the trigger. My body refused to move, frozen under the weight of its stare. The thing tilted its head slowly, almost curiously, as if it were studying me. Then, with a sudden violent motion, it slammed its hand against the glass. The windshield cracked, spiderwebbing outward from the point of impact. My paralysis broke, and I stumbled back, tripping over the fallen flashlight. The shotgun slipped from my grip and clattered to the floor. The RV shook again, harder this time, as though something massive had thrown its weight against it. The face vanished, but the pounding continued, relentless and deafening. I scrambled for the shotgun, my pulse racing. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to stop until it got inside. The creak of the RV door handle sent a jolt of terror through me. It wasn't hurried or frantic, it was deliberate, like someone testing it, savoring the act. My flashlight lay on the floor where I dropped it, its beam flickering weakly across the cabin. I gripped the shotgun tighter, my hands slick with sweat, and aimed at the door, willing myself not to pull the trigger prematurely. "Go away!" I shouted, my voice cracking under the weight of fear. The words sounded hollow, swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. The handle stopped moving. For a brief, fleeting moment, I allowed myself to hope that my outburst had scared whatever it was off. But then came the sound that shattered that illusion entirely. A low, drawn-out scraping noise, like nails being dragged across the metal siding of the RV. It started at the back and slowly made its way toward the front, the sound growing louder and more deliberate with each passing second. I couldn't move, couldn't think. My legs felt like lead, frozen in place as the scraping sound stopped just outside the driver's side window. My eyes darted toward the glass, but the faint beam of the flashlight didn't reach far enough to reveal what might be lurking there. And then I heard it again. "Jake." The whisper was so close, it might as well have been in my ear. I flinched, swinging the shotgun toward the sound, but there was nothing there. The RV's small interior felt suffocating now, the air thick and heavy with something unseen. I tried to steady my breathing, but it was no use. Panic had taken hold of me completely. A sharp knock at the windshield snapped me back to reality. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. Once, twice, 3 times. My flashlight beam trembled as I aimed it at the glass, and what I saw made my blood turn to ice. A face. It was pressed against the windshield, impossibly close, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. The features were warped, too long and angular, as though it had been stretched unnaturally. Its mouth curled into a grotesque mockery of a grin, revealing jagged, uneven teeth. But what struck me the most was its eyes. Black, endless voids that seemed to pull me in, suffocating any thought of escape. The shotgun shook in my hands, but I couldn't pull the trigger. My body refused to move, frozen under the weight of its stare. The thing tilted its head slowly, almost curiously, as if it were studying me. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, it slammed its hand against the glass. The windshield cracked, spiderwebbing outward from the point of impact. My paralysis broke, and I stumbled back, tripping over the fallen flashlight. The shotgun slipped from my grip and clattered to the floor. The RV shook again, harder this time, as though something massive had thrown its weight against it. The face vanished, but the pounding continued, relentless and deafening. I scrambled for the shotgun, my pulse racing. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to stop until it got inside. The RV shuddered again, the walls groaning as if they were being squeezed by some enormous force. I braced myself against the counter, the shotgun slipping slightly in my sweat-soaked hands. My mind raced, every instinct screaming at me to get out, to run, but where could I go? Outside was worse. Something was out there, circling, hunting. And inside? Inside didn't feel safe anymore. The growl deepened, reverberating through the floor like a distant earthquake. I scanned the interior with the flashlight, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every corner seemed darker than it had been a moment ago. My breath caught as I noticed something in the back corner of the RV, a faint outline, just barely visible in the flickering beam of light. It wasn't moving, but it was there, crouched low like a predator ready to pounce. "Show yourself!" I yelled, my voice trembling as I raised the shotgun again. The figure didn't respond. It stayed perfectly still, its edges blurring with the shadows that seemed to swirl around it. The longer I stared, the harder it was to tell where it ended, and the darkness began. And then it moved. It didn't lunge or charge. Instead, it stood, slowly unfolding itself like a puppet on strings. Its limbs were impossibly long, its head tilting unnaturally as it straightened. A low, distorted sound escaped from it. Not a growl this time, but something closer to a distorted hum, like static from a broken radio. It took a step forward, and the entire RV seemed to groan under its weight. I fired. The shotgun blast lit up the interior for a fraction of a second, the recoil slamming into my shoulder. The figure flinched, its form dissolving into the shadows like smoke blown apart by a gust of wind. For a moment the RV was still again, the only sound the ringing in my ears and my ragged breathing. But I knew it wasn't over. The air felt heavier than before, thick and oppressive, like the atmosphere right before a storm. I grabbed the flashlight and swept it around the RV, my hands trembling. The beam landed on the door, which was now wide open, swinging slightly in the cold desert wind. I froze, my chest tightening as the realization hit me. The thing wasn't just toying with me, it wanted me to leave, to step outside, to make myself vulnerable. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "I'm not going out there." But then came the whispers again, louder and more insistent than before. They were coming from everywhere, inside, outside, above, below. My name echoed through the RV, distorted and overlapping, as if a dozen voices were calling to me all at once. "Jake, Jake, come out!" The shotgun felt useless in my hands. I backed away from the door, desperate to find another way out of this nightmare. But before I could move, the whisper stopped, replaced by something far worse. A single voice, deep and resonant, spoke from the shadows behind me. "You can't hide forever." The voice was so close, it felt like it vibrated in my chest. Deep and deliberate, it carried a weight that froze me in place. I spun around, the flashlight beam darting wildly, but it caught nothing, just the cramped, cluttered interior of the RV. My pulse thundered in my ears, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out. Then the RV shifted again, not like before when it rocked violently, but subtly, like something was moving inside. I gripped the shotgun, my knuckles white, and backed toward the door. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to get out. But stepping into the open felt like an invitation to something worse. I scanned the RV again, the flashlight's erratic flickering making everything feel distorted, surreal. The shadows seemed to ripple, bending and twisting like they were alive. My eyes darted to the small, cracked mirror above the sink, and that's when I saw it. The figure was behind me, its hollow eyes locked onto mine through the reflection. Its face was gaunt, stretched unnaturally long, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, teeth jagged and uneven. My breath hitched, and before I could turn around, it spoke again, its voice low and guttural. "Why run, Jake? You belong here?" I whipped around, shotgun raised, and fired. The deafening blast filled the RV, and the recoil slammed into my shoulder. The light from the shot illuminated the interior for a fraction of a second, but the figure was gone. The shadows stilled, the oppressive silence returning with a vengeance. My hands trembled as I reloaded the shotgun, the sound of the shells clicking into place echoing in the stillness. I wasn't sure how many I had left, but it didn't matter. I wasn't fighting something that could be stopped with bullets. I turned back toward the door, and my stomach dropped. The handprints were back, smeared across the inside of the windshield now. Dozens of them, overlapping, as if whatever was out there, or in here, was trying to force its way into my mind. "Get out!" I whispered to myself, my voice shaking. "Just get out of here!" I grabbed the flashlight and bolted for the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys as I tried to start the RV. My fingers were slick with sweat, and it felt like an eternity before I finally got the engine to turn over. It sputtered for a moment, then roared to life. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. As I slammed the RV into gear, I caught movement in the corner of my eye. The figure was standing outside just beyond the headlights. It didn't move, didn't chase me. It just watched, its hollow eyes boring into me as the RV lurched forward. The whispers started again, faint at first, but growing louder as I drove away. "You can't run forever, Jake." The last thing I saw in the rearview mirror was its face, grinning in the darkness, as if it knew I'd be back. The RV rattled violently as I tore down the rough desert road, the wheels spitting gravel into the darkness. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the steering wheel, my entire body shaking. The headlights illuminated the barren landscape ahead, but every shadow felt alive, shifting and stretching in ways that didn't seem natural. The whispers hadn't stopped. They were faint now, barely audible over the roar of the engine, but they were still there, seeping into my mind like a poison. "Jake!" the voices called, overlapping and distorted, each one tugging at my resolve. "Why are you running?" I didn't answer. My only goal was to get as far from Dead Man's Gulch as possible. The RV's engine roared as I pushed it to its limits, the vehicle groaning in protest with every bump and turn. My eyes flicked constantly to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing standing in the middle of the road, watching me with those hollow eyes. The lights flickered. "No," I muttered, shaking my head as though the act could ward off whatever was coming. "Not now!" The engine sputtered once, then steadied again. But the headlights dimmed. The darkness outside seemed to close in, pressing against the glass. My pulse quickened as the whispers grew louder, their words clearer now, though they still felt wrong, twisted. "You can't escape." The voice wasn't in my head anymore. It was in the RV. I slammed on the brakes, the RV skidding to a stop on the gravel road. My heart pounded as I grabbed the shotgun, swinging it toward the back of the cabin. The flashlight sat on the passenger seat, its beam weak and unreliable, but I snatched it up, shining it into the shadows. "Show yourself!" I yelled, my voice cracking under the weight of fear. The interior was still, the faint hum of the engine the only sound, but the air felt heavy charged as though something unseen was pressing down on me. And then I saw it. At the far end of the RV, where the cramped kitchen gave way to the sleeping area, the shadows began to shift. Slowly they coalesced into a form, tall and impossibly thin. Its limbs were grotesquely long, bending in ways that defied logic, and its head tilted unnaturally as it stepped forward. The dim light barely caught its features, but the hollow eyes and jagged grin were unmistakable. "Why fight it, Jake?" it said, its voice smooth but dripping with malice. "This is where you're meant to be." I raised the shotgun, aiming directly at its chest. My hands trembled as I pulled the trigger. The blast lit up the cabin for a split second, and the figure vanished into the smoke. But the relief didn't last. From behind me, its voice came again, low and taunting. "You can't kill what isn't alive." The RV shook violently, the walls groaning as the Shadow Man's laughter filled the air. The laughter was everywhere, echoing off the walls, seeping into my bones. It wasn't loud, it was soft, almost melodic, but it carried a weight that pressed down on me, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. I spun around, the shotgun raised, desperate to find the source. My flashlight flickered wildly, the beam cutting through the thick shadows, but the cabin of the RV was empty. Empty, but not safe. "You're wasting your time, Jake," the voice said, soft and calm, yet dripping with menace. "You don't belong out there. You belong here, with me." "Shut up!" I screamed, my voice breaking. I fired again, the shotgun's deafening blast illuminating the cabin, but there was nothing to hit. The Shadow Man was gone, or worse, he was everywhere. The RV rocked again, this time harder, as if something massive had slammed into its side. I stumbled, catching myself against the counter as the shotgun slipped from my grip and clattered to the floor. The whispers started again, louder now, overlapping and distorted, weaving in and out of each other until they became an unintelligible, maddening drone. I scrambled to pick up the shotgun, my hand shaking so badly it took me 3 tries. The walls of the RV creaked under the pressure of some unseen force, and the lights dimmed further, barely casting enough glow to see. My chest tightened as I realized I had no plan, no way out. Running wasn't working. Fighting wasn't working. The laughter came again, low and mocking. "Still trying to fight, Jake? How?" I whipped the flashlight toward the sound, and my blood turned to ice. The Shadow Man stood in the doorway of the sleeping area, his form sharper now, more distinct. His arms stretched almost to the floor, his fingers impossibly long and ending in jagged tips. His head tilted, that sickening grin widening as he took a slow step forward. "You've been carrying this weight for so long," he said, his voice almost gentle, though the words cut deeper than any knife. "The grief, the guilt. Let me take it from you. All you have to do is let go." I staggered back, my heart pounding. "Stay away from me," I shouted, raising the shotgun again. But this time, my hands were so unsteady I could barely aim. Shadowman took another step, his movements fluid and unnervingly graceful. "You can't run forever, Jake. You know this. Deep down, you've always known. This was never about escape, it's about surrender." My back hit the wall, and I realized I had nowhere left to go. The cabin felt smaller, the air thicker, as though the RV itself was shrinking around me. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and the Shadow Man's grin widened further, his hollow eyes boring into me. "You've already lost," he said softly. "Let me free you." For a moment I faltered. The shotgun wavered in my hands, and for the briefest second, I felt the weight of his words settle over me like a cold blanket. The Shadow Man's words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. My grip on the shotgun faltered as a chilling numbness crept over me. The whispers grew louder, merging into a hypnotic rhythm, and for a moment, I felt an eerie calm, like sinking into deep water. His hollow eyes locked onto mine, and his grin widened as though he knew I was teetering on the edge of giving in. "This is where you belong, Jake," he said, his voice a dark melody that tugged at my thoughts. "There's no pain here, no grief, no Laura." Her name hit me like a thunderclap, snapping me out of the trance. The numbness shattered, replaced by a surge of anger that burned through the fear. I wasn't going to let this thing, whatever it was, take me. Laura wouldn't have wanted that. I tightened my grip on the shotgun, straightened up, and stared him down, forcing the words out through gritted teeth. "You're not taking me." The shadow man tilted his head, his grin faltering ever so slightly. For the first time, he seemed almost curious. "Still clinging to hope," he murmured, his tone mocking yet intrigued. "How quaint." The RV groaned under an invisible pressure, the walls bending inward as if the entire vehicle were being crushed. I struggled to stay upright as the air thickened, every breath feeling like a battle. The flashlight flickered wildly in my hand, casting fractured shadows that danced across his form. The shadow man didn't move. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to overwhelm me. But then I remembered something. The mine. The strange marks in the dirt. The stories of collapse and disaster. It wasn't just about shadows or whispers. It was about power. This thing thrived on control, on fear. If I was going to survive, I needed to break that hold. I scanned the RV, my eyes landing on the emergency road flare tucked in a compartment above the driver's seat. I'd kept it there for years, unused, just in case. Adrenaline surged as I realized it might be my only chance. Without breaking eye contact with the shadow man, I inched toward the seat, moving as slowly as I could. "You can't fight me, Jake," he said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You're only delaying the inevitable." "Maybe," I muttered, my voice steadier than I expected. "But I'm not going down without a fight." I lunged for the compartment, wrenching it open and grabbing the flare. The sudden movement seemed to startle him, his grin twisting into a snarl as he stepped forward, his long arms reaching out. My hands fumbled as I struck the flare against the ignition strip, the bright red light sparking to life and flooding the cabin with a fiery glow. The effect was immediate. The shadow man recoiled, his form rippling like smoke caught in a strong wind. The whispers turned into an ear-splitting shriek, and the RV shuddered violently as though he were trying to tear it apart from the inside. I held the flare high, the heat and light cutting through the oppressive darkness. "Get out!" I screamed, advancing toward him. For the first time, the shadow man backed away, his figure dissolving into the shadows that had birthed him. The shriek reverberated through the RV, piercing and otherworldly, as the shadow man retreated into the darkness. The flare burned brightly in my hand, its sharp glow tearing through the oppressive gloom that had consumed the space. My heart was hammering in my chest, but for the first time, I felt something I hadn't felt all night: control. I stepped forward, brandishing the flare like a weapon. The shadow man's form rippled at the edges, distorting as though he were struggling to maintain his shape. His hollow eyes flared with something close to rage, or fear. "You're not welcome here," I shouted, my voice rising above the cacophony of whispers and shrieks. The RV rocked violently as if the shadow man was lashing out in desperation. Cabinets swung open, their contents spilling onto the floor, and the metal frame groaned under the strain. I braced myself against the counter, holding the flare high, the red light pulsing like a heartbeat. "You think this changes anything?" he growled, his voice deeper now, resonating with a force that made the walls tremble. "You can burn the light as long as you want, Jake. It won't save you." But he was wrong. I could see it in the way his figure faltered, his jagged limbs losing their shape, his edges flickering like static. The flare wasn't just keeping him at bay, it was driving him out. The shadow man lunged suddenly, his elongated arms reaching for me. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flare. but the searing light caught him mid-motion. He howled, the sound tearing through my ears as his form dissolved momentarily, recoiling into the farthest corner of the RV. "This is my space," I shouted, my confidence growing with every step I took toward him. "You don't belong here." The shadow man twisted and writhed, his body flickering between shapes as though struggling to hold onto any physical form. The whispers turned into a cacophony of overlapping screams, filling every inch of the RV. The walls seemed to pulse with the sound, threatening to cave in. I struck the flare against the nearest surface, sending sparks cascading into the air. The light intensified, forcing him further into the corner. His grin had disappeared entirely, replaced by a grimace of pure rage. "You think you've won?" he hissed, his voice cracking with static. "You'll never outrun me. You can drive. You can run, but I'll always be there, waiting." "Not tonight," I shot back, my voice defiant. With a final ear-splitting screech, the Shadow Man's form collapsed into itself, vanishing into the swirling shadows that had birthed him. The RV stopped shaking, the oppressive silence rushing back in like a vacuum. I stood there, gasping for air, the flare burning low in my hand. The light flickered weakly now, but it was enough to remind me that I'd survived. For the moment, the Shadow Man was gone. But his final words echoed in my mind, chilling and certain. "I'll be waiting, Jake. Always." The RV was still. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, leaving behind an eerie silence that pressed against my ears. My breathing was ragged, my body trembling as the adrenaline began to wear off. The flare in my hand was sputtering now, its once vibrant glow dimming to a faint, flickering light. I stared at the corner where the Shadow Man had vanished, half expecting him to reappear, but the darkness stayed empty. I let out a shaky breath, lowering the flare as I glanced around the wrecked interior of the RV. Cabinets hung open, their contents spilled across the floor, and the walls bore scratches that hadn't been there before. The windshield was cracked, a web of fractures splintering out from where I'd first seen his face. It was as if the entire space had been turned inside out by the chaos. But I was still alive. Forcing myself to move, I fumbled with the emergency compartment where I'd found the flare, praying I had another. My fingers were clumsy, shaking so badly that I almost dropped the dying flare. I managed to grab one more, just one, and struck it against the ignition strip. It sparked to life, flooding the RV with its harsh red glow. The light steadied my nerves. It didn't make me feel safe, not completely, but it was a barrier, however fragile, between me and whatever might still be lingering in the shadows. I shoved the shotgun into my lap and slid into the driver's seat, the flare balanced precariously on the dash. My hand shook as I reached for the keys, praying the engine would start. "Come on," I muttered, turning the ignition. The engine coughed once, twice, and then roared to life. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. I slammed the RV into drive, my foot heavy on the gas as I tore out of Dead Man's Gulch, the gravel road crunching under the tires. The headlights cut through the night, the red flare casting eerie shadows across the dashboard as I sped down the narrow path. The whispers had stopped. The RV was eerily quiet now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror, scanning the empty road behind me. Nothing. Just the endless stretch of desert, illuminated by the dim glow of the taillights. But then I saw it. Far in the distance, standing just beyond the reach of the headlights, was the Shadow Man. His form was faint, like smoke rising against the horizon, but his hollow eyes were unmistakable. They followed me, unblinking, as I drove farther and farther away. A chill ran down my spine, and I forced myself to look away, focusing on the road ahead. "You can't run forever, Jake," his voice echoed faintly in my mind, though I couldn't tell if it was real or my imagination. I didn't stop driving until the first hints of dawn appeared on the horizon, the pale light chasing away the lingering shadows. But even as the sun rose, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. The Shadow Man wasn't gone. He was waiting, and he always would be. The sun crept over the horizon, casting pale orange light across the barren desert landscape. The RV rattled along the cracked asphalt road, its tires humming a steady rhythm, but the sound felt distant, like it belonged to someone else's world. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly they ached, and my eyes flicked constantly between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. Even though I was miles from Dead Man's Gulch, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't truly escaped. The air inside the RV still felt heavy, thick with the remnants of the night's terror. My shotgun lay on the passenger seat, the second emergency flare beside it, its bright red casing a grim reminder of how close I'd come to being consumed. The windshield was cracked, spiderwebbed from the Shadow Man's assault, and every bump in the road sent a faint shiver through the glass. I could still see his face in my mind, those hollow eyes and that twisted grin burned into my memory like a scar. I hadn't stopped driving since I left the Gulch, pushing the RV as far as it would go without breaking down. The thought of stopping, of sitting in the silence, alone, was unbearable. Every shadow, every flicker of movement in the corner of my vision made my pulse race. It was as though the Shadow Man's presence had seeped into my bones, an inescapable weight pressing down on me. Eventually, I reached a small gas station at the edge of a lonely highway. It looked like it had been dropped there by accident, a relic of a bygone era with faded paint and a single rusted pump. I pulled into the gravel lot, the RV groaning in protest as I turned off the engine. The sudden quiet was deafening, and for a moment, I just sat there, staring out at the empty landscape. The world felt too big, too empty, and yet I couldn't shake the sensation that something was still watching me. I forced myself to get out, the crunch of gravel under my boots breaking the oppressive silence. The air was sharp and cold, a stark contrast to the heat I'd expected in the desert morning. I glanced around, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just endless sand and scrub stretching out in all directions. The gas station attendant looked up as I stepped inside, his tired eyes narrowing slightly at the sight of me. I caught a glimpse of myself in the cracked mirror behind the counter, disheveled, pale, and hollow-eyed, like a man who hadn't slept in years. My hands trembled as I placed a few crumpled bills on the counter for fuel. "Rough night?" he asked, his voice rough and low. I opened my mouth to reply, but no words came. What could I say? That I'd barely escaped from something that shouldn't exist? That a shadow had chased me across the desert? Instead, I just nodded, staring down at my hands. I felt his eyes linger on me as I turned to leave, the weight of his unspoken question hanging in the air. Back at the RV, I stood by the fuel pump, watching the numbers climb as the tank slowly filled. The sharp smell of gasoline cut through the crisp morning air, grounding me for a moment. I forced myself to focus on the ordinary task, something solid and real to hold on to. But even as the pump clicked to a stop, signaling the tank was full, I couldn't shake the gnawing sensation that I wasn't alone. I glanced around the lot again. The gas station was deserted, just as it had been when I arrived. No cars, no other travelers, nothing but the faint hum of the pump and the distant rustle of the wind across the scrubland. Still, the feeling persisted. My skin prickled, and I caught myself checking the shadows near the edge of the station, half expecting to see those hollow eyes staring back at me. Climbing back into the RV, I slammed the door harder than necessary, and locked it out of instinct. The air inside was stifling, heavy with the smell of spent adrenaline and fear. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, willing myself to calm down. The Shadow Man was gone. He had to be. I'd driven miles away from that cursed gulch, and the sunlight was streaming through the cracked windshield now, chasing away the darkness. But the silence was deafening, and my thoughts refused to stay quiet. I couldn't stop replaying his final words. "You can't run forever. I'll always be waiting." They echoed in my mind, twisting my stomach into knots. Part of me wanted to laugh it off as some psychological trick, a hallucination born from stress and grief. But the handprints, the whispers, the physical force that had shaken the RV, those weren't in my head, those were real. I checked my phone, desperate for some distraction, some lifeline back to normalcy. No service, of course. Out here, in the middle of nowhere, it was just me and the memories of the night before. I tossed the phone onto the dashboard, frustrated, and started the engine again. The RV sputtered but came to life, the rumble breaking the oppressive silence. As I pulled back onto the highway, the road stretched endlessly before me, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the barren desert. I drove without direction, without purpose, just putting as much distance as I could between myself and Dead Man's Gulch. Yet no matter how far I went, the unease clung to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. The shadows inside the RV seemed longer, darker, even in the daylight. Every now and then, I thought I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, just a flicker, a ripple in the edges of my vision. Each time, my heart leapt into my throat, and I found myself gripping the wheel tighter, holding my breath until I convinced myself it was nothing. But deep down, I knew the truth. He wasn't gone. The Shadow Man wasn't finished with me. The road stretched endlessly ahead of me, an empty expanse of cracked asphalt cutting through the desert. The morning light grew brighter, but it didn't bring the comfort I'd hoped for. Instead, it cast harsh shadows across the landscape, each one a reminder of the darkness I'd left behind. The longer I drove, the more it felt like I wasn't leaving anything behind at all. The Shadow Man's voice still echoed in my mind, his mocking tone laced with certainty. "You can't run forever, Jake." My hands gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white as I tried to focus on the road. But the world outside felt distant, unreal, like I was driving through a memory instead of reality. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, expecting to see him standing in the middle of the road, those hollow eyes boring into me. Every time the wind stirred the brush, every time the light shifted, my heart raced. It was irrational. Broad daylight should have felt safe. But nothing about this felt rational anymore. Then, as I crested a small hill, I saw it. The RV's windshield was still fractured from the night before. The cracks spider-webbed across the glass. But in the middle of the webbing, faint and almost imperceptible, was a mark. At first I thought it was another crack, but as the light hit it, the shape became clear. It was a handprint. Long fingers stretched across the center of the glass, etched into the fracture as though burned into the surface. My chest tightened, and I slammed on the brakes, the RV skidding to a stop in the middle of the empty highway. The engine hummed steadily as I stared at the mark, my breath shallow. I didn't want to move, didn't want to get closer, but my curiosity was stronger than my fear. Slowly I leaned forward, my fingers trembling as I reached out to touch it. The glass was cold. Too cold. The moment my fingers brushed the handprint, a chill shot through me, so sharp and sudden it felt like ice was running through my veins. I jerked back, my heart pounding as the world around me seemed to shift. The shadows inside the RV grew darker, stretching impossibly long despite the daylight streaming through the windows. The hum of the engine sounded wrong, distorted, like it was coming from far away. And then the whispers began again. "Jake." I whipped around, searching the cabin, but there was nothing there. The sound wasn't coming from outside, it was inside. Louder now, overlapping voices calling my name, rising and falling like a twisted chant. My pulse thundered in my ears as I clutched the wheel, my knuckles turning white. "No," I muttered, shaking. I drove away. You're gone. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, filling the space around me, seeping into my mind. And then, just for a moment, I saw him again. His face, reflected in the cracked glass, his hollow eyes watching me from the shadows. He had never left. He was still with me. And that's why I'll never go RV camping alone again. What about you? Would you risk camping at a place like Dead Man's Gulch? Let me know in the comments below. Your stories might even inspire a future video. If this story gave you chills, make sure to like, share it with someone who loves a good scare, and subscribe for more hair-raising tales. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. It's only getting creepier from here.